Daydream Forgotten Sorrow is an immersive puzzle platformer, part of an atmospheric subgenre of indie titles consisting of games like Little Nightmares, Bramble the Mountain King, Unravel, or Planet of Lana. But above all else, it's a Trojan horse. When I got the opportunity to review it, I first watched the trailer and found myself captivated by the serene but suspenseful melody accompanying it. The beautiful, diverse environments and cute characters in a strange and sometimes frightening world. But alas, as the story goes, I let down my guard, I let Daydream through my gates and into my fortress, and a bunch of muscular Greek soldiers pillaged my village or something. I don't know, I'm not a historian, and I realize my metaphor is more vaguely sexual than actually informative, but the point is, needless theatrics aside, for all its gorgeous scenery and platforming potential, Daydream Forgotten Sorrow is a charmless, janky, poorly designed slog that is far less than the sum of its crude parts. And if you're looking at the footage and remain a skeptic, allow me to elaborate. Before I do, a quick look at accessibility and graphics options. There's not much. You can rebind keys for keyboard and mouse controls, but oddly not for the controller, and graphical presets don't get more granular than high, medium, and low. But the game supports DLSS and ray tracing for the rigs that can take advantage of that and runs quite well on the Steam Deck, especially if locked to 50 FPS. In Daydream, you're placed in the shoes of Griffin, a young boy who journeys through a dark fantasy world with his teddy bear Birly. There are hints early on of an overarching narrative that gives more context to Griffin's journey, but allow me to spoil the fact that the story is rough. The few cutscenes that exist to give context to Griffin and Birly are either too vague to make sense, are so poorly constructed that even the characters don't seem to know what's going on. It's clear from the visuals that Daydream is trying to be charming and make us sympathize with these protagonists, but Griffin and Birly are lifeless porcelain dolls who, aside from the first 2 minutes where they share a single hug, have virtually no interaction with one another outside the practical requirements of puzzle solving. They have no dialogue, but they don't need to. Planet of Lana doesn't either, but establishes relationships between its characters using body language and friendly chirps and gibberish that pop up during gameplay. Meanwhile, Griffin and Birly tend to make no noise at all, and many of their animations are stiff as a poorly mixed drink. Even in cases where they meet other characters, nobody communicates in any way but quick glances, and it's just so weird. My personal favorite is a sequence later in the game where Griffin is threatened by a new character and proceeds to tackle them, only for the two adversaries to suddenly be friends a few moments later for some reason. So, needless to say, unlike many other games in the subgenre, if you're playing it for the story, characters, or world, you shouldn't be playing it. You shouldn't be playing it for the atmosphere either, because Daydream Forgotten Sorrow consistently breaks immersion. I mentioned animations are pretty stiff, but they can also be unexpectedly hilarious. A few scripted death animations aside, anytime Griffin dies, he turns into a flailing ragdoll, sometimes glitching out in ridiculous ways, collapsing in the same janky way whether dying from a hot pipe that steam was spraying from or by an unexpectedly exploding firework. And while sound design is passable in some areas, sometimes it's conspicuously minimal, with little in the way of ambient noise or missing sound effects like Griffin's footsteps or objects crashing to the ground. Other times some of the sound effects are ridiculous, like anytime something is hanging from a rope it makes it sound like a dominatrix struggling to fit into her latex gear. It's not awful, but parts of it just feel cold and lifeless, which is pretty antithetical to an immersive experience. Especially when Daydream borrows so liberally from Little Nightmares. Anytime you run from creeping monsters, avoid an enemy's gaze by hiding behind objects, respawn in a fetal pose sitting on the ground, or climb your way around unnaturally proportioned, seemingly oversized furniture, it invites a comparison to that game's deeply immersive atmosphere, and not a good comparison. You don't need to buy Little Nightmares, Daydream tells you. We have Little Nightmares at home. I haven't even gotten to the gameplay yet, but you can probably imagine where this is going. In the early hours, Daydream Forgotten Sorrow's light platforming and puzzles can be passably entertaining and hint at some interesting game to come, but the Trojan horse's facade begins to quickly fade. Platforming goes from easy breezy to an utter chore at times, whether I have to jump a dozen times toward that one rope the puzzle wants me to pull before it works, or fall just as many times off a skinny little ledge that's hard to judge the dimensions of with the game's camera. Later in the game, it feels impossible to know what can be climbed or jumped on and what can't, with the rules being seemingly random at times, even on different parts of the same object. Invisible walls are a common occurrence to keep you on the right path, but even so, I would get stuck in scenery and need to reload the game several times. And good lord, the sequence in any platformer where your character walks across a thin platform over a gap is meant to create the illusion of danger more than actual danger, because it turns out that falling from the same platform dozens of times isn't very fun. Game development is tricky, and for many games, teams may throw out lots of work that seem better on paper than it does in practice. It's all part of the artistic process, figuring out what works and removing what doesn't until you end up with what is the best version of what it can be. But it feels like Daydream never went through this process and simply kept everything, whether it worked or not. Puzzle design is an excellent example of this, because these are some of the worst puzzles I've ever seen in the genre. The early game ones are fine. Simple, easy, and sometimes even a bit clever, but the more you go on, the more they become baffling and sometimes broken. Common culprits include a total lack of visual clarity on what's interactable and what isn't, inconsistent logic allowing, for example, levers that work differently depending which character pushes it, or identical looking boxes where one can be pushed and another can't, companions that don't do what you direct them to without having to ask repeatedly, companion actions that appear or disappear seemingly at random, objects I couldn't pick up on the first, second, or third try but somehow picked up on my fourth, or the numerous puzzles I'm not even sure if I completed as intended, or just cheese my way through, like the one where I used Birly as bait for a trap and he miraculously survived. Sorry about that, Birly, but hey, you made it! Some of these may sound like small issues on their own, but the combined effect is that by the halfway point of the game, I entered every puzzle filled with dread around what sort of bullshit game design I was about to butt heads with. It's not that any of them are excessively difficult, they're just that much harder to solve when the strategy you tried the first time didn't work because you weren't standing in the right place, the object pickup button didn't work, a prompt for Birly to help you out failed to appear, or the arbitrary logic made the solution trial and error either way. Oh, I can actually jump on that tiny platform, but not this other slightly larger one. Got it. It might sound like I'm being kind of hard on this game, but frankly, I don't think I am. Daydream Forgotten Sorrow feels like a Frankenstein monster of Unreal Engine student levels slapped together into a vaguely coherent game with no identity or purpose. There are moments where the art design is quite pretty, and there are a good variety of colorful landscapes, but overwhelmingly it feels held together by paperclips and bubblegum, a project where the time and the money was deeply misaligned with its scope. But as a puzzle platformer aiming for an atmospheric vibe, its refusal to commit to any one of its elements is a death by 1,000 little cuts. If you played the genre's best and want to try the rest, after numerous patches, those willing to overlook its frustrations and low-rent feel may kind of somewhat enjoy a jaunt through Daydream Forgotten Sorrow's pretty landscapes. But for most who stumble upon this indie Krampus, playing it is likely to be a sorrow indeed best forgotten.